Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about one of the biggest things I've ever finished. It is this quilt right here. It took me 6 years to finish this quilt, and today we're going to talk about why. The fabric for this quilt top, and most of the backing, is the Downton Abbey collection by Andover Fabrics. Previous to finishing this, I had never made a quilt, but I had a long history of going to fabric shops with my mom from when I was tiny because she is a sewer as well. So one day, it was early 2015 in Calgary, Alberta, where I used to live. I went to My Sewing Room, which is a fabric shop in the southeast of Calgary, and I was looking around and I fell in love with this particular print, this big blue square. So you can see it's made to look like a knit. And it's got the sort of purple pattern in there, but it's mainly blue. And then I realized that this fabric was part of a larger collection. It was a Downton Abbey collection, and I love Downton Abbey. I ended up buying a fat quarter bundle of all these fabrics. It was something I had never thought to do before. Like, I'd seen them in the fabric shops, but as someone who had never made a quilt at that point, I always thought that the fun part of making the quilt would be picking all the fabrics, and that picking like just a bundle of stuff, or even just picking from one single line or collection of fabrics, would sort of take some of the fun out of it, of trying to put together all the things you wanted. But then I saw this whole collection, and they had fat quarter bundles, and that was that. I bought the fat quarter bundle, bought a pre-cut of the blue and purple. I bought some yardage of the print that has the Downton Abbey house on it for the backing. You gonna lie on that while I talk? Yeah, good boy. Conan likes this quilt now that it's done. The only fabric that is obviously Downton Abbey is the print with the house and the words Downton Abbey on it. And then the rest of the fabrics are sort of inspired by the characters. There's a couple different types of prints in here. There's the fancier, nicer prints that the Crawley family might wear, the upstairs part of the house. And then there's also some simpler, plainer prints that might be worn by the downstairs half of the house, like Mrs. Patmore or Daisy. Having done a bit of research on this fabric collection for this video, I've realized that Andover released mood boards showing which characters different fabrics were meant to represent. A lot of what's in my quilt actually comes from the Lady Rose collection, including the blue knit print that drew me to it initially. I've also got some Lady Sybil, rest in peace, and of course the downstairs fabrics and the logo fabrics. Keep in mind that this is January of 2015. Season 6 of Downton Abbey didn't come out until September 2015, so my plan was to buy all this, make the quilt, and then watch Season 6 of Downton Abbey under my new quilt. Eventually I found a quilt pattern I wanted to use. It was the 9-patch lattice by Elizabeth Hartman, and I still have my old printout here in the quilting book that I was using. And it doesn't seem to be listed on her website anymore. It was a freebie. And I will link in the description, I found somewhere that is still hosting the freebie, so you can download if you want. Because it was a good beginner pattern, and it was good for all the fabrics I had, which was really nice. And this is the book that I used. Again, as I said, this is my first quilt, and I'd sort of absorbed a lot of quilting knowledge, I felt, from my mom and the internet before that, but I wanted a reference. And so this is by Elizabeth Hartman, the same person who did this free pattern. And it's called The Practical Guide to Patchwork. And it was helpful when I wanted to check up on things and see what I should be doing. I knew, though, from looking at this pattern and the fabric requirements, that I had bought way more fabric than I actually needed for this. I wanted a bigger quilt, and I wanted to use up as much of the fabric as I could. So if you look at her photo, you can see the big solid squares are on the edges, and then they've got the 9-patch blocks in between them all. I realized that I had enough fabric to do a full border around that quilt, put a whole other row of squares all the way around it that are the 9-patch blocks. So as you can see, mine The little squares are around the outside, and the solid squares are sort of encapsulated in them. I didn't start cutting the fabric until June of 2015. And the fun part about this pattern is you don't spend 100 years cutting out tons of tiny squares to make those 9-patch blocks. You take your fat quarters, or I had fat quarters, and you cut those into strips. And then you take 3 long thin strips and sew them together, and you do that with all the strips you have, so randomizing them so it's all different combinations of 3. And then when you've got those 3 strip sets, you iron the seams, and then you cut them this way, and then you have short strips of 3 different squares. And then you take those little strips of just the 3 squares and sew 3 of those together to create a 9-patch block. So I made sure to keep my blocks quite randomized. I know it's not random in that way if I'm messing with it, but I didn't want 2 blocks of the same fabric pattern to be touching each other, so I made sure that I really randomized all my stuff when I was sewing these little squares together. Luckily, nothing's really directional in any of these fabrics, apart from the knit print, if you look closely at the knit stitches. So I made sure the big blocks, the knit print is going up and down, but then everything else didn't really have an up or a down direction. So I first put together the layout for the quilt in July of 2015, and I remember a lot of shuffling around to make sure it looked random and evenly distributed, which, as I said, isn't the same as random, I know. So that was still pretty good timing, right, for the release of season 6 in September, but alas, it wasn't to be. Although I kept the dream alive of watching season 6 of Downton Abbey under this quilt that was not yet done at that point, I didn't watch season 6 of Downton Abbey for years because I kept saying to myself, gotta finish the quilt, then that's the reward. I thought that having that reward would help me. It didn't. So I actually sewed all the squares into the quilt top in January of 2016, a year after I bought the fabric, which honestly isn't that bad. A lot of fabric comes to live in my stash for a few years before anything gets done to it. And that's just the way it works. I buy things. Hey. That's just the way it works. I buy things, they go into the cupboard, and they sit for a while I think about them. And then I forget about them. And then I discover them again. And then I start thinking about them again. So at that point in January 2016, I also put together the backing. So I had this Downton Abbey gray fabric that I had bought originally for the backing when I didn't actually have a pattern in mind, and I hadn't bought enough. I went back to the store to see if I could get more, and I also knew there was a larger scale house print that I thought I could combine the two to look cool for the backing, but it was a year after they were selling it and it had sold out, and I think that's when I sort of discovered that fabric lines like that are sort of cyclical, and not all fabrics are all in print at the same time, which makes sense, but I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. So then I came home and I looked at my stash and I picked out this sort of blue pattern that I'd actually made a skirt out of that I don't think I own anymore. It's not quite the right tones of blue, but I thought it would kind of go, and it's a Charles Rennie Mackintosh inspired design, so I thought that would sort of fit for the Downton Abbey era. I pieced the back together with the gray fabric and that blue fabric. And then I tried to plan how I was going to quilt it. I wanted to do it all myself on my home machine because I know you could. And at first I mocked up a sort of diamond pattern, but then in the end decided to go with straight parallel lines because I thought they'd be easier. The batting package that I had bought listed how far apart you could quilt your lines with that particular batting. And it was much farther apart than the books and the internet had told me, so I decided that I would quilt straight lines the length and width of the whole quilt on either side of the seam lines of the big squares. Not all the seam lines of all the small squares, because I thought that would get too fiddly and be too much, but just on the seams of the large blue squares, so they'd have no quilting in the middle, and the middle of the 9-patch blocks would have no quilting either. According to the packaging that my batting came in, that plan was fine. My plan for the binding was to use the same blue knit print. I had enough of that once I cut out the big squares. And so at this point, still in January 2016, I sewed the quilt top together, I came up with a quilting plan, I did some test quilting on a couple of the spare squares, and then the rest of 2016 hit me. So 2016 was a big year for me. A lot of stuff happened. I quit a career, I applied to grad school, got a dog, got divorced, moved halfway across the country, and so the quilt and all its bits got packed up into a box and stayed that way for a while. At some point between then and 2019, I finished my original plan for the quilting, and I machine sewed the binding on the right side, and then I was going to fold it over and hand sew it down on the back side so you don't see any stitching holding the binding on. Keep in mind that through this I had still refused to watch season 6 of Downton Abbey because I was determined to watch it while underneath this quilt. It'd been years since season 6 came out at that point, and I still hadn't watched it. And I was trying to stay away from spoilers, but that gets hard after a few years of something being out. I feel at that point you can't complain if someone spoils something. So it was the hand sewing of the binding that was really keeping me from working on it at that point. But then in about September 2019, I got it out and started hand sewing that binding down. When I started that up again, Conan was sick at the vet. I needed something to do to take my mind off the fact that he was sick at the vet. And also, this is something that is honestly much easier to do when you don't have a dog lying on it like this, as I'm trying to stitch around. And like as I would finish a section, I need to move it so I can go on to the next section. But when there's a dog lying on it, you just don't want to move him. So September 2019 is when the Downton Abbey movie came out. And that's when I finally gave in and watched season 6. And then I went to the movie theater and watched the movie. And I didn't have my quilt for either of those, and I was very sad, but I was happy to have finally seen that last season and the movie. That's also the point where I did some more research into batting and how close or far apart your quilt line should be. And what I learned at that point was that although the batting label might say you can have 8 inches between lines of quilting, it's really recommended to have the lines closer together, especially if you want your quilt to last longer and to get that nice crinkle when you wash it. And at this point my binding is half done, and I'm wondering, what do I do about that? Do I have to unpick all the hand stitching I've done and the entire machine stitch of the binding around the edge of the quilt? So I was sort of dreading getting back to this project because I didn't quite know what I would have to do and how much, if any, unpicking would need to be done. But then 2020 happened, and it was Christmas time, and I had 2 weeks off from work, and I couldn't go anywhere or see anyone because my family is 3,000 kilometers away. So I spent a lot of time working on my hobbies that Christmas. I started and finished a Christmas quilt top, and then once I finished that, because I felt on a roll with quilting stuff, I thought, let's tackle the Downton Abbey thing. At that point, I had done enough hand stitching that the binding was done, and I knew at this point that I really did need to do the extra quilting lines, so I just decided to do it as is. With the quilt already bound, I was just going to go in and add in those extra lines. So where on this I had done 2 parallel lines every, I guess that's 3 seams on the edges of the blue, right here, here, and here, I went back and I did the extra lines of quilting. So I did 2 on either side of this seam, 2 on either side of this seam, and so on and so forth on all the smaller squares, on all the 9-patch blocks. And it took a while, but I had time, and it was easy. It was just straight lines. I'd put a movie on. I wouldn't really hear much of the movie because of the machine going, but it was nice just to be inside in the warm, quilting away. And then I finished this quilt in January of this year, January 2021, just in time for the boiler in my 100-year-old apartment building to break. And so that night, Conan and I snuggled up in bed under all the blankets in the house, including this fresh off the sewing machine quilt. And it was a very cozy night, and I have had very many good cozy naps under this quilt on the couch since then. And Conan loves sleeping on it. It's his, if he can't be on my lap, he's on the quilt. Yes, like right now. Yes. And then because I was on a roll from finishing this quilt and feeling so great about it and clearing out the storage basket that it had been kept in all these years, I went through and I found that I had 4 extra squares. 2 of them had been my test quilt squares, so I unpicked all those test lines of quilting and made a pillow out of it. So I had these 4 squares, and then I had some of the gray fabric that I cut into sashing to make the pillow big enough for this pillow form that was already on my couch. And I sewed that together. And then the back is more of the gray house fabric, and I had some extra binding strips, so I bound this edge instead of just hemming it, just for a pop of color on the back. So that's the story of my Downton Abbey 6-year quilt saga. I'm so happy it's done. It makes me so proud to know that I sewed every stitch of this guy, which I think is really cool. I can take fabric, cut it up, make it into different fabric, and then turn that into a cozy blanket. It's just so cool. And I have a matching pillow. And I'm hoping that my second quilt will not take 6 years. So I'm hoping, because this is my first quilt, and it took 6 years, and then my second quilt, I started Christmas 2020, and I have high hopes that I'll be able to be looking at my Christmas tree in my apartment, curled up in that completely finished quilt. I'm hopeful. We'll see. I had high hopes for this at the beginning, but that's going to be my goal, is to get the Christmas quilt done before Christmas 2021. And then hopefully there'll be a video on that. That one's slightly larger than this, so it's a bit more of a push to get it through the sewing machine. If you're a Downton Abbey fan like me, and you're looking for any of these fabrics to make your own project, I think they are out of print. They don't show up on the Andover website anymore when I look, but I have seen them in a few stores. In fact, the last time I went fabric shopping in person, which I think was last summer or maybe last September, Len's Mills in Toronto had some of the fabrics. They had some of the ones with the house, and then I saw more of the sort of peachy pinky series than the blue and purple series, but they had some of them. And when I was looking for pictures of stuff to do this video, I found a few fabric shops online that still have some of them, and I'll put some of those links in the description down below. And if you see anywhere that's still selling this fabric, leave a comment in case anyone's looking for it, and then it can be a sort of a pooled resource. Thank you so much for watching. It was so fun to talk about one of my proudest accomplishments for a video like this. And if you want to see more, like and subscribe, and Conan and I will be back.